Gentle Giant, one of the great prog bands, probably the deepest, most complex, out there, and least commercial of the progressive rock bands that you've actually heard of. They had a wonderful, unique, and inspired sound that blended classical music, folk, jazz, and blues with a little bit of, actually a surprising amount of blue-eyed soul influence into a absolutely wonderful concoction that was very, very unsuccessful. They're probably the least successful of the prog bands you've actually heard of, which is absolutely unsurprising and actually totally common sense until you remember that actually this was the early 70s and albums like these were topping the charts. So it sort of becomes baffling again, but I get it, you know? Anyway, today I'm covering the very first Gentle Giant album. Gentle Giant came out in 1970. Early, sort of, well, early in the sense of pre-Bowie, Tony Visconti production job. And I have to say, not one of his best. I don't know whether it was the band or whether it was him or they just didn't have that much money. The production and the recording is a little bit rough at times on this album. But the music is still great, and that's what really matters. Just a little bit of history before I get into the album itself. The core of the group was the Shulman brothers. There were three of them. They were in a band in the 60s called Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, who were sort of blue-eyed soul. They had a top 10 hit with Kites in a psychedelic pop vein, although they didn't really want to be psychedelic. That was something their management pushed them into doing, the label pushed them into doing, and they hated it. They were a blue-eyed soul band, that's what they should be doing. Which is really interesting now, of course, because we think of psychedelia as being very out there, but in its day, of course, it was pop music like everything else. And so I think it's been stated a couple of different times that the direction of Gentle Giant was a very conscious attempt to revolt against the popular music world. And there's this magnificent and incredibly pretentious quote from their second album. I think it's in the liner notes. I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but you can search it out. I think it's in their Wikipedia article. One of the most pretentious things I've ever read, but it's wonderful. And it sort of underlines the purpose of Gentle Giant as a group. But anyway, as for the album itself, like I said, one of my favorites. It's not as sophisticated as they would become. This is very much a debut album. They're in debt to some of the other groups of the time, particularly early King Crimson, but at the same time, they're uniquely their own and wonderful. And I have already wasted far too much of your time, so here we go. The tracks. The album opens up, kind of like in The Court of the Crimson King, with a driving, powerful intent of purpose, giant. Jazzy, complex, organ-focused. The lyrics are good, but they're not as complex or interesting as they would later become, and are basically just saying, the giant has come. Like a lot of the stuff on this album, it breaks down halfway through and goes into a more subdued, jazzy thing, which reprises that opening organ bit a few times before eventually returning to the head melody of the song and bringing it to a close. Funny Ways is a little bit like I Talk to the Wind from In the Court of the Crimson King, and I'm gonna stop doing this right now because honestly, this album is not that much like King Crimson. It's renaissance-y, folksish. It's a statement of authenticity and eccentricity that I very much approve of, and it's one of my favorite tracks from this album. It's complex music, but at the same time, it is deeply satisfying. It's also one of the most obvious entry points into prog for a millennial music fan, because it was of course sampled in 2004 by Madlib and the late great MF Doom on their seminal album Mad Villainy.
Through the vest, shot in the street for pulling heat on a father who gave.
The other obvious point of entry, of course, being Kanye West's sample of 21st Century Schizoid Man on Power, and I promise that will be the last time I ever talk about King Crimson in this video. This is a brilliant synth and sax-driven track with some interesting parts. It is a bit one note, but I dig it. I like the vocal effects. They kind of remind me of contemporary Doctor Who for some reason, although the song is, of course, about Dracula. This is a wonderful piece with great harmonies. I think it's about walking around a city at night. At least that's my interpretation of it. There is a little bit in the middle about, you know, maybe the end of a relationship. Like I said, this album keeps it pretty simple in the lyrics. It's, you know, it's not like the later Gentle Giant albums, which, you know, they talk about 15th century French narratives about giants, or Camus, or lengthy treatises on politics and revolution. This track begins as an ethereal ballad in a psychedelic vein about a woman who has experienced some sort of relationship failure or depression or something of that nature. And then, after a few minutes, it goes into this sort of British blues boomy, almost Led Zeppelin kind of thing. You know, it's reminiscent also a little bit of like Stand Up by Jethro Tull. I mean, it's fascinating because Gentle Giant have a little bit of that bluesiness in their DNA, and that they were, and like I said, they were sort of a blue-eyed soul group in the 60s. Under a different name, of course. It's so removed from the music you think of when you think of Gentle Giant. But it's great. It's wonderful. And eventually, after a lengthy drum solo and some piano bits, it returns to the main melody and finishes the song. This is a good track, but it's not necessarily one of my favorites. Like the midsection of the last song, it's hard rocking. It's almost pirate-ish to me. I'm not really sure why that mental association exists in my mind, but it does. And yeah, it's a good track. I like it. And so we end the album with a really cool, bluesy, proggy, jokey cover of God Save the Queen. It's a fun little performance, only lasts a minute and 40. I found myself wondering, listening to it, whether it was influenced by Jimi Hendrix's seminal performance of the Star Spangled Banner the previous year. But I'm not sure, because I don't know whether that was on the Woodstock album, whether they would have been aware of it at the time. Believe it or not, I've never actually listened to the Woodstock album. At least not in full. I've heard little bits from it. But, yeah, anyway, this is a very rambling way to close out the album. Gentle Giant is a phenomenal debut album. It pretty much gives you, maybe not quite everything, but 2/3 of what Gentle Giant were going to do. There's not as much of the sort of staccato vocal stuff. There's not as much of the really complicated melodies and rhythms. Things are still pretty simple at this stage. And I think that's a good thing. This is an album that is a very easy introduction to a band who can be very difficult. There are plenty of songs on here that are memorable in the way that prog can be memorable. It's a very user-friendly album in a way that very little else that they did during their prime years is. The only album I would say is a better intro into the band is probably Octopus, because Octopus gives you the whole package. You know, it shows you basically everything Gentle Giant can do, whereas it's them, but it's sort of pre-Gentle Giant in a way. And, you know, despite the fact that I really like this album, I would give it an easy 8.5 out of 10. It's maybe not the one. It's not the one. It's not their best, and I don't think it's the most quintessential, but it is very, very strong, and it's probably where I would send you to if you're looking to get into the band. Next week will be finally my Blonde on Blonde video, and after that I want to do some more prog reviews, talk a little bit more about this music, which I realize I haven't done a lot of reviews of in a while. I think the last big one was probably the King Crimson rating worst to best last year, but yeah, anyway, I will see you all later, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day.